Good morning, everybody. The 1960s were pretty exciting when it came to space exploration. 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, the first men, and it was on this date, December 11, in 1972, that the final moon mission occurred, Apollo 17. This is Dr. Robert Goddard with his rocket. This photo was taken in 1914, and many people consider him the father of modern rocketry. This is a V-2 rocket created by the Germans in World War II. So the Germans had some great rocket scientists, and when the war was over, we got some and the Russians got some, and probably their best one, Wernher von Braun, ended up working for NASA. Well, in 1957, the Russians put Sputnik up in orbit, the first satellite. This really made Americans nervous, and out of this came the space program. So Project Mercury called for one astronaut to go up into outer space and come back. This was just real basic science, trying to figure out how to do this, and we were beat to the punch by the Russians. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin went up into outer space. So that was a disappointment for our program. The next month in May, we sent Alan Shepard up, and a difference between his flight and Gagarin's was he piloted his spacecraft, whereas Yuri Gagarin didn't. When John Glenn did 3 orbits around the Earth in February of 1962, this was a real shot in the arm for the Mercury program. So from Mercury, we went to the Gemini program. This had 2 astronauts. Mercury had 1. Apollo will have 3. And the Gemini people focused on things like time. How long can an astronaut stay in outer space? They figured a trip to the moon would take about 8 days. Another thing the Gemini program worked on was the docking of space vehicles, how they fit, couple and uncouple, and then spacewalking. That was a real dramatic part of the Gemini program. These guys tethered to their spacecraft with a gold-plated tether. I thought that was cool. And then how about landing? How do you do that? And each time they did it, they practiced, and they got better and better at it, because that was always a real hairy thing, was the re-entry. Then the Apollo program, which had 3 astronauts, it actually got started in 1961. It was always going to be the program that put people on the moon. And it was in 1961 that President Kennedy said, we're going to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. So the Mercury program and the Gemini program were prep for the Apollo program. That was the Men on the Moon program. It started tragically, though, when the 3 astronauts of Apollo 1 burned up inside their space capsule. There are all kinds of reasons for that, and design changes were made, but it was a very tragic beginning to the Apollo program. Apollo 4 in November 1967 was the first one to use the Saturn V rocket, which would become the great rocket of the program. And then they had to practice the lunar module. How is that going to work and fly around and so on? So all these little steps to finally Apollo 11 and the landing on the moon in July 1969. Super dramatic, and those of us who watched it can remember it very, very distinctly. I think most people know about Apollo 13 because of the great movie where they almost didn't make it back alive, but they did. Very dramatic. But by the time 1972 came, the program's shelf life was over. Apollo 17 landed on this date, December 11, 1972, the last of the manned landings on the moon. So if you're in Houston sometime and you go to the Houston Space Center, check out the Saturn V rocket that's on display. It's been restored. It's just a monster. And if you go to the the National Cathedral in Washington, check out the moon rock. That's that little thing in that big red orb. A reminder of those great space programs.